My face must have shown what I was thinking, because Budlong grinned and held up a hand. I know, it sounds like gibbering, insane raving. That's only natural, because we're trapped by our own conceptions, Doctor, our necessarily limited notions of what life can be. Actually, we can't really conceive of anything very much different from ourselves and whatever other life exists on this one little planet. Prove it to yourself. What do imaginary men from Mars in our comic strips and fiction resemble? Think about it. They resemble grotesque versions of ourselves. We can't imagine anything different. Good evening, guys and ghouls, and welcome back to Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies. I'm your host, Ian Garcia. I don't remember precisely how old I was when I first saw Invasion of the Body Snatchers. I figure I must have been around 9 or 10. Like most of my experiences with old B horror and science fiction, I relied on my father just reading through the TV listings and alerting me enthusiastically to what might be cropping up on AMC, TCM, or the Sci-Fi Channel that afternoon or evening. Anyway, the Body Snatchers was on this particular day, and I remember this much. It was not at all the opportune time or climate for being scared. It must have been in the high spring or summer, because I remember the sun beaming into our TV room being bright, and just that moment or point in the day where the light it cast through the window created a reflected glare on the dusty old television set. On days and at moments like this, particularly if one was watching a black and white movie, it was almost better to just not try at all. There would be an orb of particular orange obscuring at least half of the screen, and you had to sit very close and at just the right angle to make out anything. And that angle would undoubtedly be just enough that the slight convexity of the screen would be the most apparent. The very film image, already fuzzy as it was, would seem to bulge, presenting a world of bowed people with moon faces in this non-Euclidean landscape. This was a far cry, we should say, from how the film was intended to be seen. If necessarily on home video, then at the very least in a lonely pitch darkness. In such circumstances, while I might still cannibalize my father's recommendations whenever possible, I would often watch the films with a mixture of puerile diligence and puerile impatience. Stop talking, get to the good stuff, I would say, while at the same time keeping my attention fixed on every bizarre inflection of performance, every cue of music, all of these temporally remote details of artifice that kept the entire world of the B movies separate from my own and thus made it hypnotic. It's like a wonderland of obsolete terrors, of things that are only supposed to scare me. That said, even in the ideal late-night circumstances, I was very rarely thrilled or frightened by these films, and it wasn't just the absurdity of the effects. These works were often blatantly unemotional, driven so far by beats of action and a method that sought to explain and compartmentalize what was depicted, rather than surrender them to the mysteries of my instinctual imagination. If they did seek to scare me, this pursuit was so patently obvious, it was so telegraphed, that it wasn't so much that the terror evaporated upon the cheap revelation of the hokey monster. It was rather that it was only revelation that the thing was interested in, only the revealing, rather than the visceral, physiological texture of suspense that's supposed to undergird everything, that's supposed to ferry your emotions there. It was totally just about revelation. It was totally about, again, exposing the thing, compartmentalizing it, making it concrete. Invasion of the Body Snatchers, on the other hand, this was a different beast altogether.
Jimmy, stop all this nonsense and be a good boy. Come on.
Hey, take it easy. Isn't this Jimmy Grimaldi?
Yes, Doctor. Can I talk to you a minute?
Sure. You know, I almost ran you down this morning. You got to be careful when you run out the road there.
Come on.
Hey, slow down now. Look, school isn't as bad as all that.
School isn't what upsets him. It's my daughter-in-law. He's got the crazy idea she isn't his mother.
She isn't. Don't let her get me.
Nobody's gonna get you, Jimmy.
My dad often talks to me about movies that he doesn't like, not because they are poorly made or because their stories are not emotionally compelling, but precisely the opposite. There are certain films that, especially when you're at the right age, that they're so provocative, so viscerally disturbing that they cease to be enjoyable. He can watch something as extreme as Cannibal Holocaust without batting an eye, whereas something like The Bad Seed will leave an impression on him so profound that even as a senior with 3 grown children and 3 grandchildren, he will refuse to revisit them. I don't know that my own film experiences have been so traumatic, but I do know that when I first saw Invasion of the Body Snatchers, despite its remoteness in time, despite all of the technical and circumstantial limitations in terms of how I came to view it, the final film was so arresting, so dreadful, so deeply disturbing to me, that once it was over, I was left emotionally paralyzed, unable for several hours to rejoin the real world. I had been caught up in the film like a nightmare from which I could not tear myself away and couldn't close my eyes. It helped, or I should say did not help, that the film was one of those rare examples of screen terror from the time, the nightmare of which casts a bleak shadow that extends far beyond the story's own conclusions.
Look! You fools! You're in danger! Can't you see? They're after you! They're after all of us! Our wives, our children, everyone! They're here already! You're next! You're next! You're next! You're next! You're next!
Produced by Walter Wanger and financed for distribution by Allied Artists, Invasion of the Body Snatchers is, technically speaking, easily one of the best horror and science fiction films of the 1950s. Though not overtly stylistic, the film nonetheless possesses a distinct, oppressive look, credit to cinematographer Ellsworth Fredericks and director Don Siegel, who insisted that the low-budget feature's extensive nighttime scenes should be actually shot at night, eschewing the cost-effective but aesthetically phony look of day-for-night photography, which enhanced the story's gothic, film noir feel. The special effects and prop work by Milt Rice and Don Post are a further feather in the cap of this film, efficiently deployed to punctuate a story otherwise grounded very much in human horror, with just enough of the viscerally and revoltingly alien. The film is a quintessential example of a work produced more or less completely outside of the major Hollywood studio system, aiming for low cost and high return, but which also represents a deliberate effort by such an outsider studio, in this case Allied Artists, to produce more refined, quality films that would boost their profile above their cheap and quick lowbrow legacy. A B-plus picture, if you will, rather than a true B movie. From an adapted screenplay by Daniel Mainwaring, it boasts a strong cast headed by Kevin McCarthy as Dr. Miles Bennell, the general practitioner of a small rural California town who returns home early from a medical convention in response to what appears to be an epidemic hysteria. Though never cited specifically in the film, this hysteria is a variation of what is known as Capgras delusion, named after French psychiatrist Joseph Capgras, who first published a study diagnosing the disorder in 1923. Mainly filtered through Miles' psychiatric colleague and friend Dr. Dan Kaufman, played by Larry Gates, all over town, patients are desperately reporting that their loved ones, friends, and neighbors have been replaced by imposters. These imposters are alike in every respect, from physicality to their memories, right down to their basic personalities. To anyone else, they are your uncle, your husband, your mother. But to the patient, they are all lacking some ineffable quality, an absence that, by its very nature, cannot be seen.
But Miles, there's no emotion. None. Just the pretense of it. The words, gesture, the tone of voice, everything else is the same, but not the feeling.
On the same evening, while on a romantic date with fellow divorcee Becky Driscoll, played by Dana Winter, Miles gets an urgent call from his friend Jack Belichick, played by King Donovan, to come up to his home. Arriving there, Miles and Becky find Jack and his wife Teddy, Carolyn Jones, as well as a third guest. A body under a sheet. A body with no distinctive features, but an uncannily perfect composition, as if it had never been injured, diseased, or used. A body that, while not living, does not seem to have ever lived or died. A body without fingerprints. A perfect, blank canvas.
Waiting for the final finished face to be stamped onto it.
But whose face? Tell me that.
I think we could all use a drink.
Bourbon all right?
Fine.
Not for me, thanks.
Miles, answer me. Whose face?
I haven't the slightest idea, honey. Have you?
How tall would you say that thing is?
5'10", thereabouts.
How much does it weigh?
I don't know, it's pretty thin. Maybe 140 pounds.
Jack's 5'10", and weighs 140 pounds.
Teddy, will you stop talking nonsense?
But I'm already getting ahead of myself. Because, dear listener, this episode is not going to be about Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Now, don't worry, I'm going to get to it in due time. But that will have to wait until part 2 of this two-parter. For part 1, however, we're going to be focusing on and appreciating the source of Wanger, Mainwaring, and Siegel's film. A novel first serialized in Collier's magazine in 1954 and published in hardback by Dell Books the following year. Jack Finney's, simply titled, The Body Snatchers. Welcome to the Bookworm's Crypt. I warn you that what you're starting to read is full of loose ends and unanswered questions. It will not be neatly tied up at the end, everything resolved and satisfactorily explained. Not by me, it won't anyway. Because I can't say I really know exactly what happened, or why, or just how it began, how it ended, or if it has ended. And I've been right in the thick of it. Now, if you don't like that kind of story, I'm sorry, and you'd better not read it. All I can do is tell what I know. For me, it began around 6 o'clock, a Thursday evening, October 28th, 1976. So begins Jack Finney's 1955 novel. Now, I should state that the version of the Body Snatchers that I am now reading is not the one that a first edition reader would have had in 1955, much less a Collier's subscriber in 1954. The version I'm currently reading is a digitized Kindle version of the Atria Publishing Group paperback from 2015 that bears the title Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where the back matter reports that this is taken from a Scribner paperback fiction revised and, crucially, updated edition from 1989. According to Wikipedia, Dell had released their own revised edition in 1978, likely in order to capitalize on the contemporary film remake. Even without reading the back matter, though, there are two obvious flags indicating that the edition of the novel that I'll be covering on this episode is considerably different from the 1955 edition. I'm sure the first reason for that suspicion will have already jumped out to the listener, which is that our protagonist, Dr. Miles Bennell, claims that our story begins on October 28, 1976, a full 22 years after the novel was originally serialized in Collier's. The second reason, the more compelling one, comes from this scene fairly early in the book when Miles is on a date with Becky at the local movie theater. We were lucky. We saw half the picture. Sometimes I think I've seen half of more movies than anyone else alive, and my mind is cluttered with vague, never-to-be-answered wonderings about how certain movies turned out, and how others began. Jerry Montezambert, the manager, was leaning into our aisle, beckoning to me, and I muttered a blasphemy to Becky. It was a good picture called Time and Again about a guy who finds a way to visit the past. Then we pushed our way out past 50 people, each of them equipped with 3 knees. Now, the thing to note here, and it leaps out to me completely now, is that just this aside between Miles muttering his blasphemy to Becky and then the two making their way out of the audience, the aside, the mention of the film in particular, it seems to completely break the flow of the narration and isn't seemingly relevant. Like, why is Miles taking this time to tell his reader what exact movie he was seeing amid this harrowing story of horror and paranoia? Well, it shouldn't come as any surprise, and to those who know more about Jack Finney's bibliography, it would come as no surprise. It shouldn't come as any surprise that Time and Again is the name of another Finney novel that was published in 1970. Now, there was not, nor has there been, a film adaptation of Time and Again. And maybe Finney really was developing such a story, or at least kicking around a story with the title Time and Again around the time that he wrote The Body Snatchers in 1954. Nonetheless, it's extremely odd that this edition of the novel should bear the title that it does, take place in the 1970s, and refer to a fictitious adaptation of another Jack Finney novel released in the late 70s, if this were not coming from a revised edition of the novel prepared contemporaneous to the development of the film remake. I am aware that there is a 2005 edition of the novel that is simply called The Body Snatchers, published by the Stephen King Horror Library, that has not been digitized. So not really having the time to inspect this edition or to scrounge up a Dell First Edition, I'm just letting my listeners know that I'm possibly working from a version of the novel that has been revised rather significantly, particularly in the choice to have it set in the 70s rather than the 50s. Taking for granted that the version of Finney's novel that I'm reading has been self-consciously updated to take place in the 1970s, I do want to note that whatever differences there are between the texts, the decision to set the story in the 1970s does not seem to have any significant effect on our sense of setting. It's a weird situation because I had read this edition of the novel while under the impression that this was more or less the version published by Dell in 1955. So the entire time I was convinced that the novel I was reading was a rather remarkable example of science fiction novel that is set in the near future, but which does not include any contextual elements of advanced technology or changing cultural, social, and political realities. Believing the text I was reading was written and published in 1955, I was under the impression that I was being given a glimpse into a future from the perspective that specifically precluded the notion of anything of substance actually changing in the course of 2 decades, that we as readers are actually being invited to entertain the bleak, borderline dystopian notion that there is no fundamental progress to history. And even knowing now that this was a calculated revision and update by the author, complete with an inside joke where a fictional adaptation of one of his later works acts as a stand-in for an extant contemporary adaptation of one of his earlier works, even knowing that, I am hard-pressed to attempt to disaggregate that sensation from a thematic reading of the novel. In one sense, it's kind of like Inherit the Wind or Godspell, where part of the artistic function of the work is that it's supposed to be persistently relevant, adaptable to new temporal settings while not fundamentally changing any of its characters, dialogue, or themes. But in another sense, Finney's novel is far more specifically about this notion of stasis, of a lack of progress, and the inevitable product of when something, whether it's an individual or an entire society, fails or refuses to adapt. Very thinly veiled, if veiled at all, by the foregrounded extraterrestrial horror of the Body Snatchers themselves, the imposters, the pod people. There is a background existential horror of stasis and its logical conclusion, which is entropy and decay, apocalypse. I can't know precisely how much of Finney's novel was revised and updated between 1955 and 1989 when the edition I'm reading was first printed, without reading the first edition. But without getting too lost in the weeds about it, I do find that there is enough circumstantial evidence that I can gather from the 1956 film version, which remains incredibly faithful to Finney's novel in everything from principal characters, narrative structure, and dialogue, that I can say that Finney's own revised and updated version of the novel remains very faithful to the original text as well. If we must approach the Body Snatchers with the ideal of defining a coherent thesis around the novel, then my thesis is more or less this: that the Body Snatchers is a work of science fiction and horror that is fundamentally concerned with the nature of time, and our perception of it, about what changes and what remains the same, about our respective complacency and horror towards these processes. Even without reading the text as one written in the 1950s, but taking place in the near future of the 1970s, Finney's novel is a story of characters, 2 in particular, who wake up, so to speak, to discover that the place they grew up in, the people they love, and the world they know, while for all intents and purposes being unobtrusively and exactly the same, has changed fundamentally without their even noticing. The more explicit horror of the story, the iconic pod people, are a manifestation of, and an attempt to explain the non-exclusive feeling of existential dread that are aroused by this traumatic realization, the feeling that we are being left behind, the feeling that we have lost control, the feeling that some pernicious force of alien subterfuge has taken over, perverted, and turned us against what was once pure and eternal. We can continue our plot synopsis from where we left off in the film because, again, the film adaptation is very faithful to the novel. The most notable change so far is just the name of a character. Dr. Dan Kaufman in the film is Dr. Manfred Kaufman in the book. Otherwise, especially up to this point, all the major details in terms of plot beats are basically the same. Miles returns Becky home to her father's house while Jack and Teddy stay up that night to monitor the blank body for further progress. Not long after Miles goes to sleep, he is woken up by Jack and Teddy at his door, who reveal that, just as they suspected, the body is now a perfect facsimile of Jack. Miles calls up Manny to come over to his house and, in a burst of intuition, runs over to Becky's father's house, breaks into the basement, and there discovers a second body, this one duplicating Becky. He brings Becky over to his house, meets Manny there, and then he, Manny, and Jack return to Jack's place to inspect the body there. But when they arrive, the body has disappeared. Manny suggests that Miles and the rest have simply been caught up in the mass hysteria that is afflicting the town, and assures him that Becky's double, too, was simply a figment of his active imagination. Sure enough, when Miles goes back to Becky's father's house, the body is no longer there. By the next morning, many of Miles' patients who were previously terrified about imposters now report to him to say that their delusions are gone, that they are ready to move on with their lives as before. However, that evening, with Becky, Jack, and Teddy all staying over, Miles discovers 4 giant seed pods in his basement, each growing a facsimile of each of them. Panicking over their discovery of the pods, and their gradual realization that the pod people are taking control of the telephone services, thus impeding their ability to call for help outside the town, the quartet begins to move on wild, mindless impulse. They make a run for it in Jack's car for US 101, stopping for the night in a motel. The next morning, after a cleansing rest, the group is confronted with their lack of options. When I'd showered and dressed, feeling good, grinning at Becky, I went outside and Jack was there, wandering the little paved parking area. We spoke, looking around at the morning, and then when our eyes met again, I said, "Well, what now? Where to?" Jack looked at me, his face tired and drawn. Then one shoulder lifted in a little shrug. "Home," he said. I stared at him. "Yeah, that's right," he said irritably. "Where did you think we were going?" I was frowning, suddenly angry, my mouth opening to argue with him. But I didn't. After a moment, I closed my mouth, and Jack smiled a little, nodding as though I'd said something he agreed with. "Sure," he said. "You know it as well as I do. Did you think we were going to change your name, grow a beard, and go off somewhere to start life anew?" I smiled a little too. When Jack put it into words, anything but going back home to Mill Valley was unreal, without force or conviction. It was morning now, the air bright with sun. I'd had half a night's sleep, and my brain was washed clear of horror again. The fear was there still, active and real, but I was able to think without panic. We'd had our running away, and it had done us good, me anyway. But we belonged at home, not in some vague, unknown, mythical place. And now it was time to go back, to the place we belonged, which belonged to us, and fight against whatever was happening, as best we could, and however we could. Jack knew it, and so did I. When they return, they find the roads into Mill Valley and the town itself in a dire state of disrepair and neglect, bereft of what Miles describes as at least some little signs of the endless urge to change and improve that marks the human race. Separating from Jack and Teddy, Miles and Becky make their way through the town to the public library. Previously in the story, in a scene not included in the original film adaptation, Jack shows the group a collection of articles he's clipped from newspapers about seemingly inexplicable events and phenomena, a measured attempt to dispute Manny's assertion that what they had experienced was all hysteria and delusion, that all things that people experience can be explained in terms of the material and rational. Among these articles is a story from the Mill Valley Record in which a L. Bernard Budlong, a professor of botany and biology at the local community college, quote, was quoted as denying a comment the paper had attributed to him the day before about some mysterious objects found on some pasture land outside of town. With regards to these large seed pods that were discovered, foreshadowed before their physical appearance in the novel, the paper had originally reported that Budlong claimed that they were extraterrestrial in origin. The article in Jack's collection was a retraction and apology to Budlong. Scanning through the records of the Mill Valley Library, however, Miles and Becky discover that any articles referencing Budlong or the pods have been totally excised. It wasn't a guess, but a sudden stab of direct intuitive knowledge. I knew, that's all. And I swung in my chair to stare across the room at the librarian, Miss Wegand. She stood motionless behind the big desk, her eyes fastened on us, and in an instant I swung to look at her. Her face was wooden, devoid of any expression, and the eyes were bright, achingly intent, and as inhumanly cold as the eyes of a shark. The moment was less than a moment, the flick of an eyelash, because instantly she smiled, pleasantly, inquiringly, her brows lifting in polite question. "Anything I can do?" she said with the calm, interested eagerness typical of her in all the years I had known her. Realizing that the pod people are slowly closing in on them, Jack and Becky make their last desperate visit to the home of Professor Budlong. The pleasant, inquisitive man invites them inside, and there we get a largely expository, expanded explanation of how the pods came to Earth. Basically spores floating on solar winds, although Budlong maintains an air of non-committal objectivity. Trusting him, Jack asks if there could be any connection between the hysteria of the town and the pods Budlong has seen. "Tell me this. Could these spores conceivably be some sort of weird alien organism with the ability to imitate, in fact, duplicate a human body? Turn themselves for all practical purposes into a kind of human being, indistinguishable from the real thing?" The pleasant-faced, youthful-looking man at the desk before me looked at me curiously, studying my face for a moment. Then, when he spoke, after apparently considering my question, his tone was carefully polite. He was treating an utterly absurd question, for the sake of good manners, with a seriousness it did not deserve. "I'm afraid not, Dr. Bennell. There aren't many things," he smiled at me, "that you can assert with absolute positiveness, but one of them is this. No substance in the universe could possibly reconstitute itself into the amazing structure of living bone, blood, and infinitely complex cellular organization that is a human being, or any other living animal. It's impossible. Absurd, I'm afraid. Whatever you feel you may have observed, Doctor, you're on the wrong track. I know myself how easy it is at times to be carried away by a theory, but you're a doctor, and when you think about it, you'll know I'm right." Unable to make it out of the town unobserved, Miles and Becky hole up in his upstairs office overlooking the main street of the town. Desperately trying to stay awake, fearful that even a moment of sleep will bring the horrific replacement upon them, they observe the roads into the town being cordoned off, all outsiders cleared from the streets by police, and every last man, woman, and child assembling into the town square. Farm trucks carrying the pods arrive, and they are systematically distributed to families and individuals with relatives in the outlying towns of Marin County. It becomes clear that, with Jackie and Teddy's fate unknown, that he and Becky are the only humans left in Mill Valley. The pair are discovered in the office by Manny, followed by a man Miles doesn't know, a local accountant, and Budlong himself, all of them pod people. Budlong explains that Miles' suspicions were right, that the pods were extraterrestrial in origin, and that they are evolved to travel the universe and replicate any form of life on the habitable planets they might find. Their sole purpose for being, Budlong explains, with his typically friendly and academic demeanor, is to survive by assimilating all other organic matter, not just people, but inevitably all other animal and plant life, until there is nothing left, and to then move on. Though they replicate their host organisms perfectly, right down to their very personalities, they are a hive mind devoid of emotion, particularly the drive to do, achieve, or change anything not related to their own survival. Refusing to use violence, they insist that the process of assimilation is painless, and announce their intention to simply wait until Miles and Becky go to sleep. They leave the room, placing 2 pods just outside the door, content to wait however long it takes. Suspecting that the pods will indiscriminately assimilate any organic material in close proximity, Miles places 2 complete skeletons in front of the door, as well as droplets of blood and strands of their hair. This plan works. The pods assimilate the skeletons, and the originals are disintegrated. The pod people decide to escort the pair to the prison to try again, but using hypodermic needles that they've hidden in their sleeves, Becky and he are able to subdue their captors and make a run for it into the hills outside Mill Valley. All hope seemingly futile, and with the pod people in hot pursuit, they make their way through the woods and eventually find themselves on the outskirts of a farm in which hundreds of other pods are yet being grown. In a last-ditch effort to halt the invasion, they pour drums of gasoline into the irrigation ditches of the field and set it alight. The plan fails to destroy all the pods, and the pod people apprehend them. Believing the end is near, the miraculous happens. And then, the vast low murmur of hundreds of voices all around us sounded again, and I lifted my head. Even as I looked, the murmur stopped abruptly, and I saw that everyone had stopped. They stood stock still, facing the little valley we'd climbed from, and their faces were raised to the sky in the moonlight. Now I followed their gaze, and in the clear, thin light of the moon I saw what they'd seen. The sky above us was peppered with dots. More than dots, a great awesome swarm of dark circular blobs drifted, ascending slowly and steadily into the sky. A last trail of mist left the face of the moon. The sky brightened, and I watched the pods, the field they had come from almost empty now, steadily rising. Then the last few of the pods still on the ground actually moved, leaning to one side to snap the brittle stems that held them. Then they, too, rose with the others, and we watched the great swarm, slowly diminishing in size, never touching or bumping, climbing steadily higher and higher into the sky and the spaces beyond it. In the epilogue chapter, Miles explains that his and Becky's experience of struggle and defiance was just one of many, and that the pods had simply left, realizing that the drive of humanity to survive and keep their world was greater than their sole purpose to assimilate. Those pod people who are left in Mill Valley, their lifespans being just 5 years, simply resign themselves to defeat. Once they are gone, new life simply moves in. But all in all, there's nothing much to see in or say about Mill Valley. The empty houses are filling quickly. It's a crowded county and state. And there are new people, most of them young and with children in town. There's a young couple from Nevada living next door to Becky and me, and another, we don't know their name yet, just across the street in the old Greason place. In a year, maybe 2 or 3, Mill Valley will seem no different. And what once happened here will have faded into final unbelievability. Even now, so soon, there are times, and they come more frequently, when I'm no longer certain in my mind of just what we did see, or of what really happened here. I think it's perfectly possible that we didn't actually see or correctly interpret everything that happened, or that we thought had happened. I don't know, I can't say. The human mind exaggerates and deceives itself, and I don't much care. We're together, Becky and I, for better or worse. But showers of small frogs, tiny fish, and mysterious rains of pebbles sometimes fall from out of the skies. Here and there, with no possible explanation, men are burned to death inside their clothes. And once in a while, the orderly, immutable sequences of time itself are inexplicably shifted and altered. You read these occasional queer little stories humorously written, tongue-in-cheek most of the time, or you have vague, distorted rumors of them. And this much I know. Some of them are true. It's become a mild joke on this podcast that one of the most consistent morals of sci-fi and horror fiction is that the true monster is always man. This lesson holds just as true with the Body Snatchers, which mixes elements of modern literary, hard science fiction and classic gothic horror, the latter in which greater emphasis is placed on the concept of monstrosity, on some devaluation or corruption of the apparently higher virtues that separate man from animals, than on literal monsters, whether they are born from the womb of terrestrial nature or the vast cosmic no-man's land of space. Though contemporary and latter critics viewing the text through the lens of scientific accuracy were wont to pick apart the plausibility and coherency of Finney's writing, Budlong's extensive explanation of how alien parasites like the pods might come to Earth, as well as Manny's own extensive explanations on the science of the mind with regards to the fallibility of our perceptions and our susceptibility to collective hysteria, clearly demarcates the novel as part of a trend in post-war science fiction that sought to use the medium to both create compelling narratives, as well as to earnestly and constructively spur the reader's interest in the sciences themselves throughout various disciplines. At the same time, and without contradicting this generic feature, the novel is also grounded in a much older tradition that used horror, scientific romance, and fantasy to weave expressly moralistic allegories concerned with the delicate nature of humanity, our susceptibility to our own repressed animal urges, or our prideful vanity in attempting to unseat apparently ancient traditions of divine law and make man himself his own god. Though the invasive pod people are presented by the text as a scientifically credible, existential threat that comes to threaten humanity from the outside, descending to destroy us with no act on our own part required, they are also nonetheless metaphoric of the dangerous precipice to which mankind can be brought if certain values are not heeded. The pods are not just an existential threat that will replace us. They are also, rather, literally what we as human beings are in danger of becoming, from the inside out. The most obvious way in which this metaphor is expressed is in the decision to not only have both Manny and Budlong transformed into pod people, but to position them as specific mouthpieces of apparently rational thought and modernist principles who serve to first make their victims doubt their own senses, their own intuitions, and second, once exposed, to convince their victims that all resistance to the natural forces the pods represent is futile, to just give up. As figures of scientific expertise, they are also ambassadors of modernism as a historical and ideological movement that supplanted or, per Friedrich Nietzsche's notorious aphorism, killed the Abrahamic God and divine law as the basis through which meaning and value are derived in continental and colonial European societies. This replacement of a heavenly creator who has a special plan and mission for mankind, with a mode of rational empiricism that instead proves man's finite solitude and lack of centrality in a vast, cold, and uncaring universe, pervades the terror of the story, even if not explicitly called out. Far from simply being unable to fill the void of meaning and value left by a dead god, the modern sciences of evolutionary biology, astronomy, psychiatry, they only aggravate the sense of alienation, paranoia, despair, and malaise that comes with modernity. This is rendered explicitly through Manny in particular, who undergoes an almost imperceptible arc composed of 3 philosophical stages that each correspond to Miles' consciousness of Manny's identity, from the real Manny, in quotes, to Manny as a pod person. In the first stage, early in the novel, as Miles begins entrusting his many Capgras delusion patients to his friend's psychiatric expertise, Manny is merely a curious doctor attempting to act in good faith, but who acknowledges the conflict between his own intuitions as a private individual and the prerequisite rationalism of his discipline, which he even jokingly refers to at one point as a racket. No fooling, Miles, these cases have got me stopped. Manny looked up at me speculatively, one eye narrowed. You know what I'd say about any of these cases if it weren't absolutely impossible? The Lentz woman, for example. I'd say there was no delusion at all. From every indication I know anything about, I'd say she's not particularly neurotic, at least not in that respect. I'd say she doesn't belong in my office, that her worry is external and real. I'd say, just judging from the patient, of course, that she's right, and that her uncle actually is not her uncle. Except that that's impossible. Manny looked at me curiously and added, but it's equally impossible for a total of 9 people in Mill Valley to suddenly and simultaneously acquire a virtually identical delusion. Yet, that's exactly what seems to have happened. Of particular import here is that, as a specialist, whereas Miles is a general practitioner of bodily medicine, Manny is actually more open-minded about the Lentz woman, that is, the case of Becky's sister Wilma, Miles' first patient. Manny is more open-minded about this case than Miles is. In a wonderful bit of irony, Finney has Miles inform Wilma that, quote, no matter what you feel, the trouble is inside you, as opposed to Uncle Ira, the person she believes has been replaced by the imposter. And yet, when he sends this case to Manny, the specialist and expert finds no reason to suspect delusion or particular neurosis at all. The only thing that stops him from reaching the conclusion that Uncle Ira and many others have been replaced by identical imposters is the fact that it is, rationally speaking, impossible. But at the same time, within the same purview of his field, a rash of identical, equally timed delusions of this kind is equally impossible. In response to an unprecedented crisis of mental health in their community, the representatives of rational medicine find themselves in a feedback loop, in which both scenarios are equally impossible. On the allegorical end of things, Finney is setting the stage for a breaking point. The unstoppable force of an inexplicable phenomenon, the rash of apparently credible accounts of perceived identical imposters, colliding headlong with the immovable object of rationalism, this facet of modernity. In this collision, the barrier between mere perception and material reality, delusion and fact, text and metaphor, is about to be completely destroyed. As Miles meets up with Jack and dives headlong into the nightmare of the pod people, Manny undergoes an unseen metamorphosis. When he appears again, he has reached the second stage of his arc, in which he has apparently reconciled the contradiction between the two impossible scenarios, and where he is also only briefly suspected by Miles before he forces it out of his mind to be an imposter himself. Now listen to me, he said quietly. His forearms on his knees, hands clasped, Manny sat staring down at the town. The human mind is a strange and wonderful thing, he said reflectively, but I'm not sure it will ever figure itself out. Everything else maybe, from subatomic particles to the universe, except itself. His arms swung outward, gesturing at the miniature town below us, brightening in the first morning sun. Down there in Mill Valley, a week or 10 days ago, someone formed a delusion. A member of his family was not what he seemed, but an imposter. It's not a common delusion precisely, but it happens occasionally, and every psychiatrist encounters it sooner or later. Usually he has some idea how to treat it. Manny leaned back against the front wheel of my car and smiled at us. But last week I was stumped. It's not a common delusion, yet from this one town alone there were a dozen or more such cases, all occurring within the past week or so. I'd never encountered such a thing in all of my practice before, and it had me stopped cold. Manny moved a hand absently over the stubble of his dark tan face. But I've been doing some reading lately, refreshing my mind on certain things I should have remembered before. Did you ever hear of the Mattoon Maniac? We just shook our heads and waited. Well, Manny clasped one knee between his interlocked fingers. Mattoon is a town in Illinois of maybe 20,000 people, and something happened there that you can find described in textbooks on psychology. On September 2nd, 1944, in the middle of the night, a woman phoned the police. Someone had tried to kill her neighbor with poison gas. This neighbor, a woman, had awakened around midnight. Her husband was at work on a night shift of a factory. The woman's room was filled with a peculiar, sweet-smelling, sickening odor. She tried to get up, but her legs were paralyzed. She managed to crawl to the phone and call her neighbor, who notified the police. The police arrived and did what they could. They found a door unlocked by which someone could have entered, but of course there was no one else around the house anymore. A night or so later, the police got another call, and again found a partly paralyzed, very sick woman. Someone had tried to kill her with poison gas. That same night, the same thing happened in another part of town. And when a dozen or more women were attacked in the same way on following nights, each sick and partly paralyzed from the sickly-smelling gas pumped into their rooms while they slept, the police knew they had a psychopath to find. A maniac, as the newspapers were calling him. Manny plucked a weed and began stripping the leaves from the stem. One night, a woman saw the man. She awoke to see him silhouetted against her open bedroom window, and he was pumping something like an insecticide spray into her room. She got a whiff of the gas, screamed, and the man ran. But as he turned from the window, she got a good look at him. He was tall, quite thin, and was wearing what looked like a black skull cap. Now the state police were called in, because in only a single night, 7 more women were gassed and partly paralyzed. Reporters were in town too, from the press services and most of the Chicago newspapers. You can find accounts of all this in their files. At night now, in Mattoon, Illinois, in 1944, cars filled with men carrying shotguns patrolled the streets. Neighbors organized into squads, patrolling their own blocks and shifts, and the attacks continued, and the maniac wasn't found. Finally, one night, there were 8 state police cars in town and a mobile radio unit. A doctor, prepared and waiting, was at the local Methodist hospital. That night, the police got a call, as usual. A woman, hardly able to speak, had been gassed by the madman. In less than a minute, one of the roving police cars was at her house. She was rushed to the hospital and examined by the doctor. Manny smiled. He found absolutely nothing wrong with her. Nothing. She was sent home, another call came in, and the second woman was rushed to the hospital, examined, and again, there was nothing wrong with her. All night long that happened. The calls came in, the women were examined at the hospital within minutes, and every single one of them was sent back home. For a long moment, Manny studied our faces. Then he said, "The cases that night were the last that ever happened in Mattoon. The epidemic was over. There was no maniac. There never had been one." He shook his head in puzzlement. Mass hysteria, auto-suggestion, whatever you want to call it, that's what happened to Mattoon. Why? How? Manny shrugged. I don't know. We give it names, but we don't really understand it. All we know for sure is that these things actually happen. I think Manny saw, in my face and Jack's, a sort of stubborn unwillingness to accept the implications of what he was saying, because he turned to me and, voice patient, said, "Miles, you must have read in med school about the dancing sickness that spread over Europe a couple 100 years ago." He looked at Jack. "An astounding thing," he said. "Impossible to believe, except that it happened. Whole towns began to dance, first one person, then another, then every man, woman, and child in it, till they fell dead or exhausted. The thing swept all Europe, the dancing sickness. You can read about it in your encyclopedia. It lasted an entire summer, as I recall, and then it stopped, died out, leaving people, I suppose, wondering what in the world had happened to them." Manny paused, watching us, then shrugged. "So there you are. These things are hard to believe till you see them, and even when you do see them. And that's what happened in Mill Valley. He nodded at the town at our feet. The news spreads semi-secretly at first. It's whispered around, as it was in Mattoon. Someone believes her husband, sister, aunt, or uncle is actually an undetectable imposter, a strange and exciting bit of news to hear. And then it keeps on happening, and it spreads, and there's a new case or several nearly every day. Hell, the Salem witch hunt, UFOs, they're all part of this same amazing aspect of the human mind. People live lonely lives, a lot of them. These delusions bring attention and concern. Interesting, implication of UFO hysteria there, not just because it's a science fiction story, but especially in light of just how much Manny's explanation, especially those final lines, parallels official explanations for many UFO sightings and close encounters. But make no mistake, the dancing sickness, even the Mattoon maniac, he's probably better known as the Mad Gasser of Mattoon, all of these are real-world examples of mass hysteria that Finney is citing in order to both, again, fulfill the generic expectation of modern science fiction for credible information that expands the knowledge of the reader, while also continuing to tease out the suspense and gothic horror of the story. Even if we do not yet know explicitly, as Miles does not, that Manny has been turned into a pod person, our suspicion and paranoia are aroused because this explanation, the reconciliation between two impossible phenomena, is at once too neat and another too open-ended. What it all effectively boils down to is just those first few lines, about how we may never fully understand the workings of the human mind, a premise that is proved to be somewhat disingenuous in that it is followed by an exegesis on mass hysteria that compartmentalizes it, that rationalizes it, but without providing with Miles, the listener, and we, the reader, with a sense of the value or meaning to be derived from this knowledge. Indeed, the whole point seems to redound to distilling distrust in ourselves, in our emotions and intuitions, in our consciousness of our own thoughts and being. While Manny's subversive objective at this point is to try to paralyze Miles, to get him to surrender his humanity, the allegorical point is that this is the deleterious endpoint of modernity and all of its ideology and mode of thought. Paralysis, malaise, self-doubt, submission, mere open-ended existence in the absence of all meaning and concrete conclusion, or solution, as it might turn out. This culminates finally in the third phase, the total revelation of Manny as a pod person, and the allegorical revelation of modernity itself as not merely a philosophical or scientific mode of thought, but as an ideological project compelled only to perpetuate itself and grow with the scope of knowledge, but devoid of not only empathy, of understanding of people's emotions, and sympathy and empathy with that, connection, deep human connection, but also meaning, consumed by malaise and apathy, stripping not just humanity, but life itself to the bone. "I saw something in your study," I said slowly, thinking about it. "It meant nothing to me at the time, but now you've made me remember it. And I'm remembering something Wilma Lentz said, too, before she changed." They sat, watching, quietly waiting. "You told me in your study that you were working on a thesis or paper of some sort, a scientific study, and an important one to you." "Yes." I leaned toward him, my eyes holding his, and Becky lifted her head to stare at my face, then turned to Budlong. There was only one way Wilma Letts knew Ira wasn't Ira. Just one way to tell, because it was the only difference. There was no emotion. Not really, not strong and human, but only the memory and pretense of it. In the thing that looked, talked, and acted like Ira in every other way. My voice dropped. "And there's none in you, Budlong. You can only remember it. There's no real joy, fear, hope, or excitement in you, not anymore. You live in the same kind of grayness as the filthy stuff that formed you. I smiled at him. Professor, there's a look papers get when they're left spread out on a desk for days. They lose their freshness somehow. They look different. The paper wilts, wrinkles a little from the air and moisture, or I don't know what. But you can tell by looking that they've been there a long time, and that's how yours looked. You haven't touched them since the day, whenever it was, that you stopped being Budlong, because you don't care anymore. They mean nothing to you. Ambition, hope, excitement, you haven't any. Manny! I swung to him. The high school textbook you were planning, an introduction to psychiatry, the draft you were working on every spare minute you had. What happened to it, Manny? When did you last work on it, or even look at it? All right, Miles, he said quietly. So you know. We tried to make it easy on you, that's all. Because after it was over, it wouldn't have mattered. You just wouldn't have cared. Miles, I mean it. His brows raised persuasively. It's not so bad. Ambition, excitement, what's so good about them? He said, and I could tell he meant it. And do you mean to say you'll miss the strain and worry that goes along with them? It's not bad, Miles, and I mean that. It's peaceful, it's quiet. And food still tastes good. Books are still good to read, but not to write, I said quietly. Not the labor, hope, and struggle of writing them, or feeling the emotions that make them. That's all gone, isn't it, Manny? He shrugged. I won't argue with you, Miles. You seem to have guessed pretty well how things are. No emotion. I said it aloud, but wonderingly, speaking to myself. Manny, I said as it occurred to me, can you make love, have children? He looked at me for a moment. I think you know that we can't, Miles. Hell, he said then, and it was as close to anger as he was capable of coming. You might as well know the truth. You're insisting on it. The duplication isn't perfect, and can't be. It's like the artificial compounds nuclear physicists are fooling with. Unstable, unable to hold their form. We can't live, Miles. The last of us will be dead. He gestured with his hand as though it didn't matter. In 5 years at the most. And that's not all, I said softly. It's everything living, not just men, but animals, trees, grass, everything that lives. Isn't that right, Manny? He smiled wryly, tiredly. Then he stood, walked to the windows, and pointed. There in the afternoon sky hung a crescent moon, pale and silvery in the daylight, but very clear. A thin streamer of fog was moving across it. Look at it, Miles. It's dead. There hasn't been a particle of change on its surface since man began studying it. But haven't you ever wondered why the moon is a desert of nothingness? The moon, so close to Earth, so very much like it, once even a part of it, why should it be dead? He was silent for a moment, and we stared at the silent, unchanging surface of the moon. Well, it wasn't always, Manny said softly. Once it was alive. He turned away, back to the Chesterfield. And the other planets, revolving around the same life-giving sun as this one. Mars, for example. His shoulder lifted slightly. Traces of the beings that once lived there still survive in the deserts. And now, it's the Earth's turn. And when all of these planets are used up, it doesn't matter. The spores will move on, back into space again, to drift for... It doesn't matter for how long or to where. Eventually they'll arrive... somewhere. Budlong said it. Parasites. Parasites of the universe, and they'll be the last and final survivors in it. Don't look so shocked, Doctor, Budlong was saying mildly. After all, what have you people done with the forest that covered the continent? And the farmlands you've turned into dust? You too have used them up and then... moved on. Don't look so shocked. I could hardly say it. The world, I whispered. You're going to spread over the world? He smiled tolerantly. What did you think? This county, then the next ones, and presently Northern California, Oregon, Washington, the West Coast, finally. It's an accelerating process, even faster, always more of us, fewer of you. Presently, fairly quickly, the continent. And then, yes, of course, the world. I whispered it. But where do they come from, the pods? They grow, of course. We grow them. Always more and more. I couldn't help it. "The world," I said softly. Then I cried out, "But why? Oh my God, why?" If he could have been angry, he would have. But Budlong only shook his head tolerantly. Doctor, you don't learn. You don't seem to take it in. What have I been telling you? What do you do? And for what reason? Why do you breathe, eat, sleep, make love, and reproduce your kind? Because it's your function, your reason for being. There's no other reason and none needed. Again, he shook his head in wonder that I failed to understand. You look shocked, actually sick, and yet what has the human race done except spread over this planet till it swarms the globe several billion strong? What have you done with this very continent but expand till you fill it? And where are the buffalo who roamed this land before you? Gone. Where's the passenger pigeon, which literally darkened the skies of America in flocks of billions? The last one died in a Philadelphia zoo in 1913. Doctor, the function of life is to live if it can, and no other motive can ever be allowed to interfere with that. There is no malice involved. Did you hate the buffalo? We must continue because we must. Can't you understand that? He smiled at me pleasantly. It's the nature of the beast. Critically, the pod people are never presented as outwardly malicious or even disingenuous per se, because they themselves do not see what they are doing as malicious or disingenuous. They are detached from empathy towards their victims. They, of course, do not and instinctively cannot allow humans to choose whether or not they are to become assimilated. But this detachment does not itself constitute an absence of feeling, even affinity. The pod people do feel. Indeed, it could be argued that they may feel to a degree of urgency that goes beyond our own human conceptions of what feeling is, bounded as it is in the American context frequently by the nuclear family or the small, closely knit, tightly bordered society. It is not what the pods do or do not feel that makes them monstrous. It is what and how they think that poses the existential threat. One of the incredible facets of Finney's writing is how he never relents in toying with the reader's sense of who or what to trust, not just the pod people, but all of the characters. The pod people are themselves, indeed, presented as much more psychologically and emotionally complex than how their loved ones turned victims ultimately perceive them. When Miles visits one of the first patients of the hysteria, Becky's cousin Wilma, she can only express her suspicion that her Uncle Ira has been replaced by an imposter in terms of him lacking emotion, possessing only the pretense of it, which psychiatrists and psychologists would call shallow affect, a hallmark trait of individuals with narcissistic or psychopathic personality types. But even at the very end of the novel, Miles suggests, quoting again, that we didn't actually see or correctly interpret everything that happened, or that we thought had happened. Miles is quite literally telling us that he himself, as a narrator, is fundamentally unreliable. And with the use of the first-person collective we, rather than I, he as a character is necessarily implicating others, Becky, Jack, and Teddy especially, in this assertion. Framing the story in such a way, with his narrator warning the hypothetical reader from the get-go that his account is full of loose ends and unanswered questions, Finney invites us to scrutinize the text rather than strictly relying on it as an authoritative fictional account. The point is not to say that nothing that Miles describes or relates to us secondhand is reliable. The point is that the apparent narrative, how Miles' discrete impressions of experiences and memories ultimately cohere into a contrived sequence, is necessarily rhetorical. Miles is trying to convince himself of something, and also to convince us as readers of something, of some notion or idea. With regards to the pod people, we as readers are told through secondhand accounts by Miles and through Miles' own memories of his experience that they lack emotion or feeling. But when Budlong is presented to us through Miles' narrative, We are nonetheless presented with a character who lacks empathy for Miles and Becky, but is nonetheless highly emotive in how he expresses himself to them. He displays authentic fascination with his own being, authentic passion in describing the science and cosmic history of the pods, and feels an authentic need to appeal to Miles first, rather than just sedating him, locking him up, and assimilating him. He does not feel authentic empathy for Miles, he is not willing to give him a choice in the matter, but he nonetheless feels an authentic need for Miles to empathize with him, to feel understood, for Miles to go somewhat willingly, to consent. What is true for Budlong is even truer for Manny. Lacking empathy, just as with all the pod people, Manny is nonetheless a facsimile of Miles' former friend who has the same personality and all the same memories. When attempting to convince Miles to submit to them willingly, he expresses authentic frustration and exasperation, even certain resentment that Miles does not trust him on a personal level. He does not behave as if he is an imposter. Like all the pod people, he understands himself as a continuation of Manny, not as someone who has been taken over or replaced, but as someone who has joined with something else. There's even a certain implication that the only reason the scene in Miles' office transpires the way it does, with the characters present, is not a function of a highly calculated hive mind, but a deliberate move on his own part. Manny looked up at me for a moment, then added gently, "But there's no way you can keep from sleeping either. You can fight it off for a time, but finally, you'll have to sleep." The little man near the door, I'd forgotten he existed, sighed and said, "Lock them in a cell at the jail. They'll sleep eventually. Why all the argument?" Manny looked at him coldly. "Because these people are friends of mine. Go on home if you want to. 3 of us is enough." Though ostensibly a hive mind, the pod people are nonetheless variations of a species that can only adapt by specifically replicating a previous life form. Thus, in the case of human beings, they also incorporate all of the particularity, all of the social complexity of the host population. These beings cannot simply act by some telepathy. They must organize themselves through the extant mechanisms of a collective composed of discrete individuals. And in such a context, while their motivations seem monolithically driven, there nonetheless remains a degree of individual freedom. Manny does not, so to speak, need to be there, but he has elected to be because of his personal connection to Miles, which he still feels deeply, not merely as a pretense or shallow effect. Not only has he elected to participate, he is leading the enterprise and allowed great discretion in terms of what methods are used and how they proceed. This particular absence of strictly authoritarian organization proves to be a weak spot. 3 people, it turns out, is not enough to contain 2. But the fact that the situation even transpires the way it does illustrates succinctly the emotional nuance of these supposed alien monsters. Their strengths are our strengths, and their weaknesses are our own weaknesses. What makes them and us strong is the ability to organize around common interest and shared goal. But what makes them and us weak, and what makes Manny in particular in this scene weak, is that each individual component of this collective is subject to drives and emotional needs that frequently undermine such collective will. Manny's plan doesn't pan out and deleteriously leads to the surrender of his new society, because, ironically, he feels too strongly and too personally. He cares too much. In depicting the existential threat of the pods, Finney is clearly deriving terror not from the absence of emotion per se, but from the presence of something in human consciousness under modernity. This becomes all the more apparent when we move on from scrutinizing the nuanced depiction of the pods themselves to interrogating how, quote, real people themselves are depicted. The pods exceptionalize a quality of mankind under modernity that Finney sees as degrading to the concept of humanity, bound up in the endless urge to change and improve, to be productive and progressive, but which is nonetheless preceded by qualities endemic to the human condition under modernity, which do not literally require a fantastic manifestation of monstrosity to reach the same deleterious ends. Budlong and Manny make that critique well enough when they put it to Miles that humans, speaking from a position that centralizes continental and colonial Europeans, have developed a fundamentally extractive and pernicious relationship with the Earth. But even on the basis of basic social relations and behaviors, the Body Snatchers is replete with examples of Miles' susceptibility to apathy, malaise, and despair. Indeed, in a critical bit of opening narration, Miles expresses a desire for such an absence of empathy, a desire to extricate himself from some higher ideal of what humanity should strive for, and to succumb to cynicism. Now at my desk, I added a note to my patient's case record. Then I took the medicinal brandy, went to the washroom, and mixed a drink, something I almost never did. But I did that night, and standing at the window behind my desk, staring down at Throckmorton Street, I sipped it. I'd had an emergency appendectomy and no lunch that afternoon, and felt irritable. I still wasn't used to being at loose ends, and wished I had some fun to look forward to that evening for a change. So when I heard the light rapping on the outer locked door of my reception room, I just wanted to stand there motionless till whoever it was went away. In any other business you could do that, but not in mine. My nurse had gone. She'd probably raced the last patient to the stairway, winning handily. But now, for a moment or so, one foot on a chair, I just sipped my drink, looking down at the street and pretending as the gentle rapping began again, that I wasn't going to answer it. Another critical example from early in the text further compounds the dramatic irony of the story, that in many ways Miles as a character seems more like and more predisposed to becoming a subversive, apathetic pod person than Manny. When Manny is confronted with Wilma's case, he actually can't bring himself to conclude, one way or the other, that she is delusional. It is Miles who admits that the entire scenario is actually outside of his specialty to diagnose, but who explicitly tells Wilma, in softer terms, that she is crazy, that the problem is coming from within her, that there is no crisis outside. And revisiting that very scene, the proximity between the pod people's calculated misdirection of their victims, their operating by pretense, and the way in which Miles describes his own confrontation with Wilma is made all the more striking. Wilma claims that it's as if Uncle Ira, now a pod person, is merely, quote, talking by rote. And Miles' own description of the end of the scene mirrors precisely that idea, talking by rote, of an interaction governed largely by rote and pretense rather than authentic engagement. I muttered some nonsense about relaxing, taking it easy, not worrying, and so on, and Wilma smiled gently and put her hand on my arm, the way a woman does when she forgives a man for failing her. In the first scene with Professor Budlong, another implication of unconscious social pretenses not only foreshadows that character's revelation as a pod person, but also necessarily implicates Miles' own character. Professor Budlong brought his hands together over his chest, the fingertips of one hand touching the tips of the other. And it occurred to me that professors must get so they unconsciously act the way people think professors ought to act. And I wondered if doctors did too. Finney's prose is filled with these subtle little cues to the allegorical function of his work, but without a doubt the most blatant and striking is this scene, in which Miles and Becky have returned to the town and are spying on the family of pod people assembled at the home of Becky's father. It's extensive, but I'm going to quote it at length because, well, just give a listen here. Then something happened without warning, that made the hair on the back of my neck prickle and stand erect. This is very hard to explain, but when I was in college, a middle-aged black man had a shoe shine stand on the sidewalk before one of the older hotels, and he was a town character. Everyone patronized Billy, because he was everyone's notion of what a character should be. He had the title for each regular customer. "Mornin', Professor," he'd say soberly to a thin, glasses-wearing businessman who sat down for a shoe shine each day. "A greetin' to you, Captain," he'd say to someone else. "Howdy do, Colonel." "Nice evening, Doctor." "General, I'm pleased to see you." The flattery was obvious, and people always smiled to show they weren't taken in by it, but they liked it just the same. Billy professed a genuine love for shoes. He'd nod with approving criticalness when you showed up with a new pair. "Good leather," he'd murmur, nodding with a considered conviction. "Pleasure to work on shoes like these." And you'd feel a glow of foolish pride in your own good taste. If your shoes were old, he might hold one cupped in his hand when he'd finished with it, twisting it a little from side to side to catch the light. "Nothing takes the shine like good aged leather, Lieutenant, nothing." And if you ever showed up with a cheap pair of shoes, his silence gave conviction to his compliments of the past. With Billy, the shoe shine man, you had the feeling of being with that rarest of persons, a happy man. He obviously took contentment in one of the simpler occupations of the world, and the money involved seemed actually unimportant. When you put them into his hands, he didn't even look at the coins you had given him. His acceptance was absent-minded, his attention devoted to your shoes and to you, and you walked away feeling a little glow as though you'd just done a good deed. One night I was up till dawn in a student escapade of no importance now, and alone in my old car I found myself in the rundown section of town, a good 2 miles from the campus. I was suddenly aching for sleep, too tired to drive on home. I pulled to the curb, and with the sun just beginning to show, I curled up in the back seat under the old blanket I kept there. Maybe half a minute later, nearly asleep, I was pulled awake again by steps on the sidewalk beside me, and a man's voice said quietly, "Mornin', Bill." My head below the level of the car window, I couldn't see who was talking, but I heard another voice, tired and irritable, reply, "Hi, Charlie." And the second voice was familiar, though I couldn't quite place it. Then it continued in a suddenly strange and altered tone. "Mornin', Professor," it said with a queer, twisted heartiness. "Mornin'," it repeated. "Man, just look at those shoes. You had them shoes, let me see now, 56 years come Tuesday, and they still takes a lovely shine." The voice was Billy's. The words and tone, those the town knew with affection, but parodied and a shade off key. "Take it easy, Bill," the first voice murmured uneasily, but Billy ignored it. "I just love those shoes, Colonel," he continued in a suddenly vicious, jeering imitation of his familiar patter. "That's all I want, Colonel, just to handle people's shoes. Let me kiss 'em. Please let me kiss your feet." The pent-up bitterness of years tainted every word and syllable he spoke, and then, for a full minute perhaps, standing there on the sidewalk of the slum he lived in, Billy went on with this quietly hysterical parody of himself, his friend occasionally murmuring, "Relax, Bill. Come on now, take it easy." But Billy continued, and never before in my life had I heard such ugly, bitter, and vicious contempt in a voice. Contempt for the people taken in by his daily antics, but even more for himself, the man who supplied the servility they bought from him. Then abruptly he stopped, laughed once, harshly, and said, "See ya, Charlie." And his friend laughed too, uncomfortably, and said, "Don't let him get you down, Bill." Then the footsteps resumed in opposite directions. I never again had my shoes shined at Billy's stand, and I was careful never even to pass it except once when I forgot. Then I heard Billy's voice say, "Now there's a shine, Commander." And I glanced up to see Billy's face alight with simple pleasure in the gleaming shoe he held in his hand. I looked at the heavy-set man in the chair and saw his face smiling patronizingly at Billy's bowed head, and I turned away and walked on, ashamed for us all. Now, I sincerely hope that this wasn't just something added to the updated version of the novel, because it would be profoundly affecting for me to know that a white author writing a story about alien invasion in the mid-50s would, in the middle of everything, write an extended flashback that not only critiqued race relations, but specifically expressed the understanding that black American minorities comport themselves in ways around whites that masks their own feelings of shame and humiliation. Now, obviously, in one sense, Finney is literally juxtaposing the pod people on whom Miles is spying with this struggling old black man from his childhood. There is a problematic, almost boogeyman-like quality to this figure, but make no mistake, there is no rational continuity between the present scene and Miles' spontaneous memory. What binds them is the non-exclusive theme of how social relationships under modernity are governed heavily by pretense, disingenuousness, and coercion. Miles, as a teenager, was not ashamed of or angry towards Billy the shoeshine. He was ashamed of and angry towards himself and all the other white folks. On the one hand, there is a thematic continuity being drawn between the endemic racism of his town and the complacency of his white neighbors towards it, and then the inhuman threat of the pod people. On the other hand, if Billy himself has been rendered a pod person, metaphorically, this has not come about from some outside invasion. It blooms from the endemic miasma of American racism and hierarchy. In both cases, that which degrades humanity, that which leads to paralysis, despair, shame, loneliness, even hysteria — he even uses the term hysterical to describe Billy's behavior — is a deleterious function of how society is already organized. Again, not all pod people are alike. The true monster is man, and this is especially poignant when we stop to consider critically who and what kinds of people are actually being centered as defining what it even means to be human. It's good that we ended things on a traumatic flashback, because it brings us back around to the thesis that started us here. That Jack Finney's The Body Snatchers is a work of science fiction and horror that is fundamentally concerned with the nature of time and our perception of it, about what changes and what remains the same, about our respective complacency and horror towards those processes. Obviously, Miles is obsessed with a conception of what it means to be human that is bound up in the endless urge to change and improve. The pod people are exceptionally horrific because, while they are inherently malleable and adaptable, they are fundamentally unproductive and apathetic. They cannot actively change or improve anything, and indeed, they lack any ambition for such activities. They are consumed by a myopic drive to perpetuate what already exists unto oblivion once they've extracted everything else in the service of that. But as we have seen, a direct continuity is drawn between the existential horror of the pod people and what already constitutes this limited view of mankind under modernity. The pod people do not invade and corrupt what is human. They grow organically from a pre-extant stasis and complacency. The horror that they represent is a Gnostic and occult one, which is to say, a horror of traumatic knowledge that was once deeply hidden by a combination of an imposed facade contrived by modernity, as well as our own particular complacency and cynical denial. In as far as this horror is expressed through the desolation of personal relationships, the nuclear family and friends, it is also expressed through the edifices of society itself, the town that, all of a sudden, seems to be succumbing to neglect and immiseration. Not talking much, we walked for half a dozen blocks, and I looked around me. I'd driven the streets of Mill Valley every day. I'd been in this very block not a week before, and everything I was seeing now had been here to see then, except that You don't really see the familiar until it's thrust upon you. You don't actually notice until there's a reason to do so. But now there was a reason, and I looked around me, really seeing the street and the houses along it, trying to soak up every impression they could give me. I couldn't possibly describe any specific way in which anything I saw seemed different. Yet things did in a way words can't explain. But if I were an artist, painting the way Sycamore Street seemed to be, walking along now with Becky, I think I'd distort the windows of the houses we'd pass. I'd show them with half-drawn shades, the bottom edge of each shade curving downward, so that the windows looked like heavy-lidded, watchful eyes, quietly and terribly aware of us as we passed through the silent street. I'd show the porch rails and stair rails hugging the old houses like protective arms, suddenly guarding them against our curiosity. I'd paint the houses themselves as huddled and crouching, alien and withdrawn, resentful, evil, and full of icy malice against the two figures walking along the street between them. And somehow I'd depict the very trees and lawns, the street and sky above us as dark, though it was actually clear and sunny, and give the picture a brooding, silent, fearful quality. And I think I'd make every color just a shade off key. I don't know if that would convey what I felt, but something was wrong and I knew it. And then I knew that Becky did too. "Miles," she said in a cautious, lowered tone, "am I imagining it, or does this street look dead?" I shook my head. "You're not wrong. In 7 blocks we haven't passed a single house with as much as a trim being repainted. Not a roof, porch, or even a cracked window being repaired. Not a tree, shrub, or a blade of grass being planted or even trimmed. Nothing's happening, Becky. Nobody's doing anything. And they haven't for days, maybe weeks." It was true. We walked 3 more blocks, to Blythedale, and then on to Throckmorton, and saw not a sign of change. We might have been on a finished stage set, completed to the last nail and final stroke of a brush. Yet you can't walk for blocks on an ordinary street inhabited by human beings without seeing evidences of, say, a garage being built, a new cement sidewalk being laid, a yard being spaded, a new window being installed. At least some little signs of the endless urge to change and improve that marks the human race. We turned onto Throckmorton, and while there were people on the sidewalks and cars beside the parking meters, somehow the street seemed surprisingly empty and inactive. Except for the occasional slam of a car door or the sound of a voice, the street was very nearly silent for as much as half a block at a time, the way it is late at night with the town asleep. A great deal of what we saw then I'd seen before driving along Throckmorton, on my way to house calls, but I hadn't really noticed, hadn't really looked at this street I'd been seeing all my life. But I did now. And I suddenly remembered the empty store I'd seen near my office. Because now, in the first few blocks, our footsteps plainly audible on the walk, we passed 3 more empty stores. The windows had been whitened, and through them, dimly, we could see the interiors littered and uncleaned. And they looked as though they'd been empty for some time now. We passed under the Milltown Tavern sign, and the letters RN in Tavern were missing. The windows were fly-specked, the cardboard liquor signs badly sun-faded. There was only one customer sitting motionless at the bar. The doors were open and we glanced in as we passed. And the place was silent. The in-place was closed up, for good apparently, because the counter stools were unbolted and lying on their sides on the floor. A shoe store still had some 4th of July advertising in the window, some children's shoes grouped around it, and over the shine of their leather lay a fine layer of dust. The Sequoia Theater, when we came to it, had a placard in an outside display case, and it read, "Open Saturday and Sunday evenings only." I noticed again, as Becky and I walked along the street, how much paper and litter there was. The city trash basket stood full, and torn sheets of newspaper and tiny drifts of dust lay in the corners of store entrances and at the bases of street lamps and mailboxes. In the little town square, the weeds were high, untended for days. Becky murmured, "The popcorn wagon's gone." And I saw that it was. For years, a red-wheeled, glass-and-gilt popcorn wagon had stood beside the bus station daytimes, and now it and Eddie, the middle-aged man who owned and ran it, were gone. Dave's diner lay just ahead. The last time I'd eaten there, I'd wondered vaguely why there'd been so few customers. And now I wondered again as we stopped to glance in through the plate glass, for only 2 people were having lunch at a time when it should have been crowded. Fastened to the window, as always, was the day's menu, photocopied daily, and I looked at it. There was a choice of 3 entrees, and for years they'd always had 6 or 8. "Miles, when did all this happen?" Becky gestured to indicate the length of the semi-deserted street behind and ahead of us. "A little at a time," I said, and shrugged. "We're just realizing it now. The town's dying." What Finney describes in this passage, as well as numerous preceding, subtler examples throughout the earlier text, could easily be any number of American towns and cities that, once prospering in the immediate post-war era, progressively succumbed to the entropy of poor social investment, population flight, and the decline of private agriculture or national manufacturing. While, like Budlong and Manny's papers, this decay is in one sense literally supposed to represent the sheer extent of the pod people's total absence of humanity, their lack of ambition or concern in changing and improving the town, we must again remember to scrutinize Miles as a self-consciously unreliable narrator, and thus turn to the possibility that many of the qualities he notices now, occurring a little at a time, did not suddenly come about because of an invasion. They had been happening for a long time, since before the pods even arrived. And it becomes a chicken and egg question. What went first, the material conditions of the town or the humanity, so to speak, of those who live within it? Thanks largely to Allied artists' film adaptation, the Body Snatchers in book and film form has been frequently cited as one of the quintessential Red Scare stories of the 1950s. In recent decades, there's been a concerted effort by some critics, historians, and fan authors, however, to downplay this reading, suggesting that the work is fundamentally apolitical, that its horrific scenario of emotionless, hive-minded pod people threatening to take over the world could just as easily be read as an allegory for authoritarianism of both the right and left wing. But such readings seem to be largely executed from a defensive position of uncritical enthusiasm, those espousing this point wanting to distance the work that they love from a perceived slander, rather than to authentically engage in a consistent ideological critique. These individuals may know that the Red Scare and the Blacklist were bad or whatever, that's what they're supposed to think, but they rarely, if ever, actually dwell upon the significance of reactionary and conservative politics in the United States contemporary to when the text was written, the disasters it architected, the millions of lives that it raped and ruined globally. This apolitical conflation of far-right and far-left politics is, in itself, a patently reactionary framework that necessarily reappropriates and adapts the propaganda of the times, unempirically framing them as equally pernicious forces that can be neatly conflated as a matter of common sense, when the reality is that the story of political oppression in the United States has never at any point been a function of the left, and that whatever violence transpired in the name of left-wing causes during this period, well into the 70s, had never once been an iota comparable to the accelerating right-wing hegemony that demonized it. If one is to read Finney's novel as a straight story, taking Miles' narration at face value, then we are forced to contend with the fact that the character's vision of humanity, with some exceptions, is wedded to a highly specific ideological wing, which is bound up in a Protestant work ethic, obsessed with productivity and a jingoistic nostalgia for the Second World War as defining what is ostensibly exceptional in humanity, but which, as per usual in American fiction of this period, critically centers American whites as definitive of the whole world, Here it is from the epilogue chapter. Quite simply, the great pods were leaving a fierce and inhospitable planet. I knew it utterly, and a wave of exultation so violent it left me trembling swept through my body. Because I knew Becky and I had played our part in what was now happening. We hadn't, and couldn't possibly have been, I saw this now, the only souls who had stumbled and blundered onto what had been happening in Mill Valley. There'd been others, of course, individuals and little groups, who had done what we had, who had simply refused to give up. Many had lost, but some of us who had not been caught and trapped without a chance had fought implacably, and a fragment of a wartime speech moved through my mind. We shall fight them in the fields, and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender. True then for one people, it was true always for the whole human race. And now I felt that nothing in the whole vast universe could defeat us. Like, obviously the quotation by Winston Churchill is referring to fascists, but again, in your heart of hearts, who do you think this invasive hive mind force that threatens all of humanity, but where America is uniquely centered to oppose them on the behalf of all humanity, again, who do you think in your heart of hearts that is supposed to invoke? In 1955, what sorts of geopolitical situations do you think that's referring to? In 1955, how do you think the deployment of a quote by Winston Churchill, originally made to rally against fascism, was being propagandized? Who do you think conservatives like Winston Churchill were talking shit about in 1955, that is, when they weren't busy trying to stop their imperial subjects and national workers from getting any funny ideas about what their rights were? Don't be a big boomer baby. Nobody wants to hear this both sides bullshit 65 years later. And here's the thing. I don't even think that the Body Snatchers is a reactionary work. Like, Jesus Christ, if there's any point, the point is not this both side shit, that it could be anything. It's fundamentally and subversively leftist. The pod people are not communists. Communists aren't hanging around in small rural towns with Mill Valley Bargain Jubilee buttons on their suspenders, rounding up outsiders, and when the fucking infrastructure is going to shit all around them and local business is collapsing, the communists aren't like, nah, everything is fine, don't worry about it, why bother, time to enjoy your sunset years. You know, the communists aren't the ones who are developing, you know, what the character describes, which is the idea of the suburbs themselves as being cold and alienating, with the houses being like fortresses that are hostile to the people who are just walking the street. That's not the goddamn communists. It's a rarefied, horrific caricature of small-town, rural, southern conservative complacency. Like, it's sitting right there on the surface. The people of the pod people are the folks who are so sure that their old Uncle Tom actually likes their cracker ass. It's a joke. The book is a satire. Like Miles alludes to at the end, Finney's doing it very deliberately, it's tongue-in-cheek. The book is a satire. It's illustrating the logical, deleterious progression of American life under a conservative, capitalist modernity. This is where we're going. The pod people come from within. Like, just think about it for a second. Even the supposedly happy ending of the story is patently horrific. Basically, literally everyone in this town dies except for 4 people, and the end result is nobody cares. Life goes on, a bunch of newlyweds and their ugly children move in like hermit crabs, and the whole fucking process starts over again. And this gets me back to the point, again, about Miles as an unreliable narrator, about Finney's prose giving us hints that we're supposed to be scrutinizing it a lot more because he's saying, look, despite the representation of the pods as the horrific extent of social organization under modernity, teaching us to only think in alienated, rational terms and to doubt our own senses of the truth. Despite all that, the point really is that you can't just take things at face value. At least not in an imposed fashion, not in some fashion of just accepting common sense and just going through the world like, well, everything's operating as it should, because how could it not be? The point isn't to not doubt your intuition. The point is to actually look more carefully at things, more diligently, so you can realize when you're actually... Not that you're being brainwashed, not that you're being turned into a pod person, but that you're already a pod person, that you're already just a plant in a cold, extractive, savage ecosystem where literally whole societies are interchangeable if it keeps the gears of capital flowing. Given that the narration is unreliable, by definition, by admission of the character, how do we know that this happy ending actually happened? How do we know that he didn't just fall asleep? That this is all the dream, and that when he woke up, he was a pod person, and that you, the reader, are still in the midst of an active invasion, and that he is distracting you from it with this shallow effect of the book appealing to your own inherent superiority? Like, after all he's been through, after all the shit, even if he only thinks he's seen it, just listen to how he describes it. Listen to his present state of mind. But all in all, there's nothing much to see in or say about Mill Valley. The empty houses are filling quickly, it's a crowded county and state, and there are new people, most of them young and with children, in town. There's a young couple from Nevada living next door to Becky and me, and another, we don't know their name yet, just across the street in the old Greason place. The Greasons who are fucking dead from alien parasites. Anyway, in a year, maybe 2 or 3, Mill Valley will seem no different to the eye from any other small town. In 5 years, perhaps less, it will be no different, and what once happened here will have faded into final unbelievability. Even now, so soon, there are times, and they come more frequently, when I'm no longer certain in my mind of just what we did see, or of what really happened here. I think it's perfectly possible that we didn't actually see or correctly interpret everything that happened or that we thought had happened. I don't know, I can't say, the human mind exaggerates and deceives itself. And I don't much care. We're together, Becky and I, for better or worse. Where is this change? Where is this endless urge to change and improve? What is changing? What is improved? Nothing. It's returning to sameness. It's right back to stasis. The process just starts over again. Like, just this resignation, after all of this, to the unchanging, and to not caring, to just gesturing it away, just like Manny or Budlong would have. That specific way of framing it. That sudden turn from this great triumphant ending to just deciding that you don't give a shit if it's all real or not. This is not the story of a man. This is the story of a plant who dreamed he was a man. But now the dream is over, and the plant is awake.
Plants have feelings, just like people. It's fascinating. This type of music stimulates the growth of the plants.